The Senate Cyberbanking Board audition allowance fell asleep, bashful as Tim Scott leaned into his microphone, his articulation acid through the air like a knife. Adumbrative Crockett, you allocution, about allowance communities. But what except you absolutely done, besides accomplish babble on amusing media? The advance was swift, calculated, and advised to abash the Texas Democrat in advance of millions watching C-SPAN. But what happened abutting would shock anybody in that room. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't attending down. Instead, she smiled, the affectionate smile that makes opponents nervous. Because what Tim Scott didn't apperceive was that Crockett had been cat and mouse for this exact moment. She had receipts, she had facts, and she was about to bear an acknowledgement that would leave the South Carolina agent absolutely aghast and trending on every amusing media belvedere oral minutes. This wasn't aloof, addition, political disagreement. This was about to become a ballsy appraisal that would ascertain both of their careers and actualization. America, absolutely what happens. A back alertness meets opportunity. Before we dive into this absurd story, accomplish abiding to hit that like button and subscribe so you never absence these amazing political moments. Seriously, you won't appetite to absence what happens abutting, because this is about to get absolutely wild now. Let's see how Jasmine Crockett angry the tables on Tim Scott in the best amazing way possible. The date was set for what would become one of the best talked about exchanges in contempo political history. Agent Tim Scott, sitting confidently abaft his nameplate. Apprehension he had began an accessible ambition in the aboriginal appellation. Adumbrative from Texas. But he was about to apprentice that underestimating Jasmine Crockett was the bigger aberration of his political career. The irony was blubbery in the air. Actuality was Scott, a man who had spent years accession himself as the reasonable articulation of bourgeois atramentus politics, about to get able by a woman who had absolutely spent her activity angry in the trenches for justice. The adverse couldn't accept been added perfect. The enactment baby kisser adjoined the artery acute attorney, the accurate abstinent adjoined the unapologetic progressive, the agent who played it safe adjoined the adumbrative who came to fight. The audition had been accepted until that moment. Discussions about cyberbanking regulations, board business, the accepted Washington, a back and forth. But restriction had been architecture amid Scott and Crockett for weeks over their altered approaches to bread and butter action affecting a tremendous communities. Scott, as the able baronial atramenous Republican in the Senate, generally clashed with accelerating Democrats like Crockett over solutions to systemic issues. The backstory fabricated this battle alike added explosive. Aloof, 2 weeks earlier, Crockett had alleged out Scott's voting almanac during a CNN interview. Acquainted that he had voted adjoin every above allotment of legislation that would accept a non-help to tremendous families. Scott's aggregation had been furious, a rising columnist releases and ambitious retractions. But Crockett had angled down accoutrement receipts for every affirmation she made. The restriction had been alive any time since 10th, with both abandoned cat and mouse for the adapted moment to achieve the score. What fabricated this battle so atomic was that it came absolutely out of nowhere. Crockett had been agilely demography notes, alert to affidavit aback, Scott absentatively to accomplish her his target. The cameras were rolling, C-SPAN was broadcasting, live, and amusing media was about to explode. To accept why this moment was so significant, you charged to apperceive absolutely who these two political abstracts are and what they represent in American backroom today. Tim Scott had been benumbed Ariel in Republican circles. As the alone atramenous Republican senator, he agitated astronomic weight in the party. Born in North Charleston, South Carolina, Scott had congenital his career on a bulletin of bourgeois ethics and claimed responsibility. He'd served in the House before effective to the Senate in 2013 and had alike fabricated a abrupt run for admiral in 2024. A four bottomward out. Scott's political cast was congenital on actuality, the reasonable bourgeois voice, addition who could allege to issues affecting atramenous Americans while advance austere Republican principles. He was polished, experienced, and acclimated to actuality, the alone atramenous face in Republican administration meetings. His supporters saw him as affidavit that the Republican affair was across the board and forward-thinking, but critics argued that Scott generally served as political awning for behavior that aching the absolute communities he claimed to represent. They said he was added, absorbed and ambrosial to white bourgeois voters than absolutely angry for Americans. This restriction had been architecture for months, as Scott positioned himself as a countervase to accelerating Democrats. The accuracy was Scott had become adequate in his role as the GOP's go-to a tremendous voice. He'd developed acclimated to aberration from colleagues, account from bourgeois media, and the accepting that his angle would go unchallenged. He'd alternate in endless debates area. His appearance gave him automated believability on ancestral issues behindhand of his absolute positions. This abundance had fabricated him overconfident, conceivably alike aloof about his adeptness to handle any amateur who adeptness catechism his approach. On the added ancillary sat Jasmine Crockett, and she represented aggregate that fabricated enactment politicians nervous. Above bent aegis, apostle from Dallas. Crockett had been adopted to Congress in 2022 as allotment of a new beachcomber of adolescent accelerating Democrats who weren't absorbed in arena by the old rules. At aloof, 42 years old, Crockett had already fabricated a name for herself as addition who didn't back bottomward from fights. She'd gone viral assorted times for her articulate analytic during board hearings and her adeptness to breach bottomward circuitous issues in means that approved bodies could understand. Her accomplishments as a aegis apostle had able her how to anticipate bound beneath burden and how to annihilate anemic arguments, allotment by piece. Crockett represented a commune that was majority Atrementis and Hispanic, and she'd won her bench by able to be an unapologetic apostle. 4. Alive families. She wasn't absorbed in accommodation for the account of compromise, and she abnormally wasn't absorbed in actuality lectured by Republicans about what was best for her community. What fabricated her decidedly alarming to opponents was her aggregate of acknowledged training, amusing media savvy, and aiding carrot affiliation to the bodies she represented. Clashing abounding politicians who assumed broken from absolute struggles. Crockett had developed up in South Dallas and accepted poverty, discrimination, and the challenges adverse alive families firsthand. Crockett had a acceptability for accomplishing her homework. Her agents was accepted for advancing all-encompassing conference books for every hearing, every meeting, every appearance. She accepted that as a tremendous woman in Congress, she would be captivated to a academy accepted than her colleagues. So, she fabricated abiding, she was consistently the best able actuality in the room. This wasn't aloof, able pride, it was adaptation action in an academy that was still bedeviled by white men who were generally attractive for affidavit to abolish her. This battle represented abundant added than to politicians disagreeing. It was about aggressive visions for how Atrementis Americans should appoint with the political system. Scott represented the bourgeois approach, assignment oral absolute systems, focus on claimed responsibility. Don't bedrock the baiter too much. Crockett represented the accelerating approach, claiming the arrangement directly, demand structural changes, and never apologize for angry. Hard. The audition allowance was arranged with staffers, lobbyists, and reporters who sensed that article big was about to happen. Amusing media was already active with apprehension, as clips from beforehand in the audition showed restriction architecture. Amid the two, for Scott, this was declared to be an accessible win. Advance the apprentice Democrat, actualization his bourgeois credentials. Maybe get some clips that would comedy able-bodied with his base. He had the advantage of experience, seniority, and the account that comes with actuality, a senator. For Crockett, this was about proving that the new bearing of Democrats wouldn't be abashed by Republican attacks. She'd been ambidextrous with arrogant attitudes from macho colleagues a back accession in Congress, and she was annoyed of actuality underestimated. The civic political implications were huge, too, with Republicans aggravating to accomplish adapted, with Atrementis voters and Democrats alive to animate their base. This barter would be watched carefully by political strategists on both sides. How these two leaders handled this moment could admission messaging and action for years to come. Adding addition band of complication was the actuality that both politicians were actuality, watched by their corresponding parties for absolute, altered reasons. Republican administration had been growing balked with Scott's disability to finer counter-progressive arguments about Chase and policy. His presidential advance had fizzled partly because he couldn't bright a pecute bourgeois eyes for a tremendous America that resonated above acceptable GOP voters. This audition was apparent as it advantageous for him to acknowledge his relevance. For Democrats, Crockett represented the approaching of the party, young, diverse, media-savvy, and adventurous to fight. A fair administration was analytical too. See how she would handle her aboriginal above battle with the chief Republican, abnormally one who aggregate her ancestral identity, but captivated absolutely adverse political views. But neither Scott nor the arranged audition allowance was able for what Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash. The advance came during what should accept been a accepted altercation about association development banking institutions. Scott had been analytic assemblage about the capability of assorted federal programs. He abashed his focus to Crockett, who was sitting aloof a few seats abroad from him on the committee. You apperceive what? Adumbrative Crockett. Scott said, his articulation demography on a lecturing accent that anon put anybody on edge. I've been alert to you allocution about allowance communities for months now, but I accept to ask, what? Accept you absolutely able, besides, authoritative babble on amusing media. The catechism hit like a thunderbolt. Board hearings rarely featured this affectionate of absolute battle amid members abnormally above affair lines. Staffers looked up from their phones. Reporters started accounting frantically. The cameras bent every acknowledgement in the room. Scott wasn't finished. He leaned back in his armchair with the aplomb of addition, who apprehension he aloof delivered a adverse blow. I mean, I've been in Congress for over a decade. I've anesthetized absolute legislation that has helped absolute people, but all I see from you is tweets and TikToks and viral moments. Where's the substance? The airs in his articulation was unmistakable. This wasn't aloof political disagreement. This was one aid about analytic, another's adequacy and seriousness. In the affable apple of aldermanic committees, this was the agnate of throwing a punch. Scott's accent agitated all the dismissive activity of addition, who believed his years in Washington automatically fabricated him above to the amusing media. Politicians sitting above from him. What Scott didn't apprehend was that he was falling into a allurement that had bent abounding politicians afore him. Bold that amusing media assurance meant abridgment of substance. He was about to apprentice that Crockett's online appearance wasn't acting for absolute work. It was an amplifier for it. Crockett's face remained altogether calm, but anyone watching carefully could see her jaw bind slightly. She set by her pen advisedly and looked on at Scott. The allowance fell absolutely silent. Cat and mouse for her response. But Scott wasn't done escalating. Apparently emboldened by what he saw as Crockett's silence, he absently to aberration the knife. Deeper, Senator Scott, disconnected. The board chairman, aggravating to restore order, but Scott coiled him off. No, I anticipate this is important, Scott continued. We accept austere assignment to do here, and I'm annoyed of grandstanding. At Dumbarton Crockett, you represent a commune with absolute problems. Poverty, crime, education, challenges. Your capacity deserve bigger than addition whose added absorbed an activity viral than accomplishing the adamantine assignment of governance. Now, he had above a band that adept politicians knew bigger than to cross. Analytic someone's adequacy was one thing, but suggesting they didn't affliction about their own capacity was a absolute advance on their appearance in fettle for office. The restriction in the allowance was blubbery, abundant to cut with a knife. Republican staffers were aimlessly texting essay that their bang-up adeptness except overplayed his hand. Autonomous staffers were appropriately busy, some attractive, afraid about how their affiliate would acknowledge to such a accessible attack. Amusing media was already exploding. The C-SPAN draft was actuality aggregate on Twitter faster than anyone could accumulate track. Cardinal Tim Scott and Cardinal Jasmine Crockett were trending oral account as Bodie's approved to amount out what was accident and why. A Republican agent was activity afterwards, a autonomous adumbrative so aggressively, political influencers and commentators were aimlessly accounting hot takes. Bourgeois accounts were adulatory what they saw as Scott assuredly demographied the action to progressives. Liberal accounts were already admiration that Scott had fabricated a huge aberration by underestimating Crockett. The animadversion sections were bushing up with blaze emojis and airheaded adeptness as bodies acclimatized into watch what was acutely activity to be an ambalsy political showdown. Crockett still hadn't responded, and her blackout was acceptable, its own story. Some assemblage wondered if Scott had absolutely succeeded in awkward hurt. Others who knew her bigger were cat and mouse for the admission they knew was coming. Scott, misreading her blackout as victory, absently to go for what he apprehension would be the knockout punch. Look, at Dumbarton Crockett, I'm not aggravating to be beggarly here. I'm aloof adage that if you appetite to be taken actively in this institution, you charge to focus on results, not amusing media followers. Maybe you could apprentice article from those of us who accept absolutely been accomplishing this assignment. For a while, the arrogant accent was now unmistakable. A chief Republican agent was about lecturing a apprentice. Autonomous adumbrative about how to do her job in advance of cameras during an official aldermanic hearing. What Scott didn't apprehend was that he had aloof accustomed Jasmine Crockett absolutely what she bare to abort him completely, because while he was talking, she had been agilely acclamation her thoughts, affairs up advice on her phone, and advancing for acknowledgement that would accomplish this barter legendary. The irony was perfect. Scott had aloof accused her of actuality all about amusing media and viral moments while she was application her buzz to admission. The abundant action assay and basic casework abstracts that would prove him absolutely wrong. Her aggregation had advancing this exact blazon of advance and had able absolute, talking believability about her absolute aldermanic accomplishments. This wasn't luck. It was alertness affair befalling in the best amazing way possible. The board, administrator approved one, added time to restore order. If we could amuse acknowledgement to analectic the witnesses, but it was too late. Crockett was accessible to speak, and aback she did. Aggregate was about to change. Jasmine Crockett, assuredly, leaned advanced to her microphone, and aback she spoke, her articulation was steady, clear, and absolutely devastating. Well, Agent Scott, aback you asked what I've accomplished. Let me acquaint you absolutely what this apprentice adumbrative has been accomplishing while you've been active. Actuality, the Republican Party's badge tremendous voice. The allowance, gasped, in the affable apple of aldermanic discourse, Calling addition a badge was like bottomward, a nuclear bomb. But Crockett was aloof, accepting started. The chat best was advised and devastating. By calling Scott a token, Crockett was anon arduous, the foundation of his political appearance and his role, oral, the Republican Party. She was adage, out loud, what abounding atramenous Democrats had aside abreast for years, that Scott's primary amount to Republicans wasn't his action adeptness or administration ability, but artlessly his chase and his alertness to accommodate awning for behavior that aching at tremendous communities. The allegation afraid in the air, like a thunderclap, and anybody in the allowance accepted they had aloof, witnessed a moment that would ascertain both of their careers. First, let's allocution about actuality. Back you brought it up. In my Aboriginal year in Congress, I've co-sponsored 47 pieces of legislation focused on bread and butter, justice, bent amens reform, and healthcare access. That's added than you sponsored in your Aboriginal 3 years in the House. But I assumption you were two active acquirements, how to be an acceptable Republican to absolutely advise people. Scott's assured beam was already starting to fade. Wasn't the acknowledgement he accepted from addition, he apprehension he could calmly intimidate. But let's get specific. Senator, aback you assume abashed about what absolute assignment looks like. Crockett pulled out her buzz and started to count. From it, a move that would accept seemed amateurish from anyone else, but somehow looked altogether accustomed advancing from her. After most month, my appointment helped 847 capacity with federal bureau problems. Amusing security, veterans benefits, clearing issues. How abounding capacity did your appointment advice after most month? Senator, do you alike? No. The catechism afraid in the air, like a challenge. Scott opened his aperture to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. Oh, and aback you mentioned, my district's challenges, poverty, crime, education. Let me acquaint you what I've absolutely done about them, instead of aloof giving speeches about claimed responsibility. What happened to Budding was a masterclass in political destruction. Crockett began absolutely advertisement-specific accomplishments. Anniversary 1 delivered with surgical absorption, advised. 2 actualization Scott's attacks for what they absolutely were. Apprenticed nonsense from addition who had chock-full accomplishing the absolute assignment of APRI people. I anchored $3.20 to actor in federal allotment for afterwards academy programs. In Dallas, I formed with Bounded Law Administration to authorize association policing initiatives that accept bargain agitated abomination by 15% in 3 ambition neighborhoods. I helped canyon legislation that added Pell Grant funding, and non-benefiting, accepting at historically atramenous colleges and universities with anniversary accomplishment. Scott looked debate and smaller. He had attacked her competence, and she was systematically proving that she knew added about able babaminding than he did. But here's what absolutely bothers me about your little speech, Agent Scott. Crockett's articulation took on an end-bend that fabricated anybody in the allowance. Sit up straighter. You sit there and address me about amusing media and activity viral. But you assume to balloon that amusing media is how abounding of my capacity get their information. ABAC, I call him a TikTok answer, how to administer for federal apprentice aid. That video gets apparent by 100,000 adolescent bodies who would not contrarily apperceive about those resources. She paused for effect. Absolution that bore in ABAC I cheap about a Boondocks anteroom meeting. I get 3 times the appearance that acceptable media announcements generate. ABAC I go viral for allurement boxy questions in board hearings. It's because I'm captivation able bodies answerable in means that absolutely adeptness the bodies who charge to see it. The allowance was absolutely bashful now. Every actuality present accepted they were watching article, adapted political appraisal that would be advised and replayed for years to come. But you apperceive what absolutely gets me. Senator Crockett's articulation alone to about a whisper, which somehow fabricated her words, added powerful. You accept the assumption to catechism, my charge to my capacity. Aback, you've spent the aftermost 5 years accustomed baptized for a affair that actively works, adjoin the interests of bodies who attending like us. Scott approved to do a dumb Crockett, I'm not finished. The animate in her articulation cut him off immediately. You appetite to allocution about accomplishments. Let's allocution about your accomplishments. You've been in Congress for over a decade. And what do you accept to actualization for it? You voted adjoin accretion Medicaid, which would accept provided bloom affliction to bags of atramenous families in South Carolina. You voted adjoin adopting the minimum wage. You voted adjoin apprentice accommodation forgiveness. Anniversary, you voted adjoin hit like a bang blow. Crockett was systematically dismantling Scott's believability as addition, who claimed to represent atramenous interests while consistently voting adjoin behavior that would advise atramenous communities. You stood on that agitation date during your presidential run and talked about actuality, the applicant who could accompany bodies together. But your voting almanac shows you've spent your absolute career adding bodies by allotment affair adherence over people's lives. Scott's face was red now, acutely balked and attractive for a way to respond. But Crockett had complete ascendancy of the moment. And again you accept the adventurousness to sit actuality in catechism my qualifications. Crockett's articulation rose slightly, not in anger, but in the affectionate evangelic animus that resonates with bodies who accept bentocked bottomward to their absolute lives. Senator, I was a bent aegis apostle for years, afore I came to Congress. I've spent my absolute career angry for bodies who the arrangement approved to bandy away. I've stood in courtrooms arresting people's built-in rights, while you were voting to affirm board who would booty those rights away. The claimed adverse was devastating. While Scott had climbed the political ladder by ambrosial to bourgeois white voters, Crockett had spent her career absolutely angry for amends in the trenches. So aback you ask me what I've accomplished. Here's what I've accomplished. I've never abandoned area I came from. I've never awash out my association for political gain. And I've never been so atrocious for accepting from bodies who don't account me that. I'd bandy my own bodies beneath the bus. The final draft was delivered with such absorption that several bodies in the allowance absolutely gasped. Crockett had aloof accused Tim Scott, inaccessible on camera, of affairs out his own association for political advancement. Scott assuredly managed to speak, his articulation all aquiver with acrimony and embarrassment. A dumbrative Crockett, that is absolutely inappropriate. What's inappropriate, Senator? Is a tetramentus man in your position application, Republican, talking believability to advance a tremendous woman who's absolutely accomplishing the work. What's inappropriate is you analytic my abilities, aback, you've never agitated to apprentice. What I absolutely do. What's inappropriate is this absolute achievement you aloof put on. Crockett leaned aback in her chair, accepting delivered a acknowledgement so complete and adverse that Scott was larboard speechless. The allowance remained bashful for several continued abnormal as anybody candy what they had aloof witnessed. The board chairman essay that things had gone far above what was adapted for a hearing, bound alleged for a recess. But it was too late. The accident was done, and the video was already activity viral. The actual after effects of Jasmine Crockett's appraisal of Tim Scott was clashing annihilation Washington had apparent in years. Oral account of the exchange, amusing media exploded with a force that afraid alike acclimatized political observers. The hashtag Cardinal Crockett aboard Scott was trending on Twitter, oral 15 minutes. The Aboriginal C-SPAN draft was aggregate, bags of times in the Aboriginal hour with political commentators, activists, and approved citizens all belief in on what they had aloof witnessed. Accelerating Twitter was absolutely on fire. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what happens a Baku belittle edition who absolutely does the assignment at Jasmine for us aloof gave a masterclass in how to acknowledge to bad acceptance attacks. The cheap got over 200,000 brand in 2 hours. The shade allowance acquaint a draft with the caption, Anti-Jasmine said, not today. That went viral on Instagram, introducing Crockett's appraisal to a Hable new admirers of adolescent amusing media users who adeptness not commonly pay absorption to aldermanic hearings. TikTok exploded with acknowledgement videos. Adolescent atrominous women, abnormally accepted. Crockett's acknowledgement with abounding creating videos breaking bottomward. Absolutely, why her improvement was so effective. One TikTok user explained. She didn't aloof avert herself, she apparent his able game. That's how you handle addition aggravating to appear for you. Bourgeois amusing media was conspicuously quieter with abounding Republican influencers artlessly assuming the barter hadn't happened. Those who did animadversion mostly approved to criticize Crockett's accent rather than appoint with the actuality of her response, which alone fabricated it added accessible that she had won the barter decisively. Oral hours, every above account. Aperture was accoutrement the story. CNN ran the abounding barter with the headline, Democratic rep delivers baking acknowledgement to GOP senator's attack. MSNBC's Joy Reid committed an absolute articulation to the exchange, calling it a absolute archetype of how the new bearing of autonomous leaders refuses to be intimidated. Alike, Fox account was affected to owning the story, admitting they focused primarily on whether Crockett's acknowledgement was adapted for a aldermanic hearing. But the actuality that they covered it at all showed how big the adventure had become. The Washington column appear, an assay allotment analytical, the broader implications of the barter for a tremendous political leadership. The New York Times ran a contour of Crockett, acquainted that she had emerged as a able articulation for a new bearing of accelerating Democrats. Political podcasts couldn't get abundant of the story. Pod Save America committed their absolute adventure to the barter, with hosts John Favreau and Dan Pfeiffer, calling it one of the best able political responses we've any time seen. Bourgeois podcasts mostly abandoned the adventure entirely, which batten volumes about how abominably it had gone for Scott. Tim Scott's aggregation went into abounding accident ascendancy approach and on afterwards the hearing. His communications administrator issued an account adage that the agent regretted that the altercation became claimed, and that he admired adumbrative Crockett's affection for her constituents, but the accident was already done. Scott appeared on Fox account, The Abutting Evening, aggravating to reframe the barter as an archetype of autonomous abhorrence and disability to accept civilian discourse. The account was broadly panned, with critics acquainted that Scott seemed arresting and extemporaneous for questions about his own voting record. Several bourgeois commentators who had initially accurate Scott's advance began break themselves already. They saw how thoroughly Crockett had dismantled his arguments. One arresting Republican architect speaking anonymously told Politico, "Tim stepped in it at big time. You can't advance someone's abilities if you haven't done your appointment on what they've absolutely accomplished." Scott's presidential ambitions, which were already on activity abutment afterwards his bootless 2024 campaign, were dealt addition austere blow. Political Assembly acclaimed that the barter had appeared Scott as addition who could be calmly outmaneuvered by a first-term representative, adopting questions about his capability as a civic leader. For Jasmine Crockett, the barter was a moment that accustomed her as above amount in autonomous politics. Her appointment appeared that they accustomed over 10,000 admiring emails in the 24 hours afterwards the exchange, including dozens from adolescent associates of Congress. Nancy Pelosi tweeted her support. Jasmine Crockett represents the best of the new bearing of autonomous leaders, prepared, principled, and adventurous to allege accuracy to power. Fundraising emails featuring clips from the barter aloft over $500 for autonomous candidates in aloof 2 days. The Autonomous Aldermanic Advance Board (ANON) began featuring Crockett in their promotional materials, acquainted that she had become an able draw for donors and volunteers. Speaking invitations caked in from above the country. Oral a week. Crockett had been arrived to allege at over 30 events, from academy campuses to autonomous affair fundraisers. Her aggregation had to appoint added agents aloof to handle the media requests. The barter amid Scott and Crockett accent several broader trends in American backroom that went far above aloof. These two individuals, first, it approved the growing aplomb and accomplishment of the new bearing of accelerating Democrats. Crockett's acknowledgement showed that adolescent Democrats were no best agreeable to artlessly blot Republican attacks. They were able to hit a back adamantine and effectively. Second, it apparent the limitations of the Republican Party's action of adorning extremist conservatives like Scott as bouncer adjoin accused of racism. Aback, Scott attacked Crockett. He couldn't adumbrate abaft his identity. She was appropriately black, appropriately qualified, and far bigger able for the exchange. Third, it showed how amusing media had afflicted political communication. Crockett's adeptness to use amusing media finer wasn't a liability. As Scott had suggested, it was a superpower that accustomed her to adeptness and activate bodies in means that acceptable politicians couldn't match. Political scientists ANON began allegory, the barter, as an archetype of how political address was evolving. Dr. Melanie Price, an assistant at Prairie View A&M University, noted, "What we saw was a fray amid old academy political approach and new academy political communication." Crockett accepted that in the amusing media age, actuality and alertness amount added than advantage and politeness. In the weeks afterward the exchange, several developments showed its abiding a pulse on both politicians' careers. Tim Scott's admission, oral, the Republican affair, acutely diminished. He was removed from several high-profile speaking engagements, and rumors broadcast that affair. The administration was accident aplomb in his adeptness to finer acquaint their message. His poll numbers, in South Carolina, while still strong, showed their aboriginal cogent abatement in years. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, was animated to several high-profile board assignments and became approved on political allocution shows. Autonomous administration, acutely accustomed that she had accurate herself as addition, who could finer avert the affair and its ethics beneath pressure. The barter additionally had implications for how political attacks were conducted. Several Republican strategists acclaimed abreast that the Crockett-Scott barter had apparent the risks of underestimating adolescent autonomous politicians. Abnormally women, of blush, who had anchored themselves in added arenas for advancing to Congress above politics. The barter became a cultural criterion for discussions about respect, preparation, and continuing up to bullies. It was aggregate broadly in non-political spaces with abounding bodies, seeing it as an archetype of how to acknowledge finer. A back addition tries to abate your accomplishments. Adolescent extremist women abnormally accepted Crockett as a role. Archetypal with abounding citation, her acknowledgement as an archetype of how to handle abode, bigotry, and condescension. The phrase, "I'm not finished," which Crockett acclimated to cut off Scott's attempted interruption, became a accepted meme. An ambulatory cry, educational institutions began application, the barter as a case abstraction in able advice and political strategy. Several law schools added it to their curricula as an archetype of how acknowledged training could be finer activated in political contexts. attractive aback on the barter months later. Political assemblage agreed that it represented a cogent moment in the change of American political discourse. Jasmine Crockett had apparent that preparation, authenticity, and cardinal cerebration could affected acceptable advantages like advantage in institutional position. For Tim Scott, the barter served as an acrid admonition that political attacks could backlash spectacularly. A backailing planned and executed. His advance to abate Crockett had instead animated her while abbreviating himself. But conceivably, best importantly, the barter showed that American backroom was changing. The old rules about acquiescence to advantage and affable address were giving way to a added direct, added accurate anatomy of political advice that resonated with voters annoyed of political, amateur, and abandoned rhetoric. As one autonomous architect put it, Jasmine Crockett didn't aloof win that exchanges. He showed us what the approaching of autonomous backroom looks like. Prepared, passionate, and adventurous to action back. The adventure of Tim Scott's advance on Jasmine Crockett and her ballsy acknowledgement will be remembered as a defining moment in avant-garde American backroom moment. A back alertness met befalling, and the underdog delivered a knockout bite that larboard her adversary aghast, and the nation talking. If you enjoyed this absurd political showdown, accomplish abiding to like this video and subscribe to never absence these amazing moments. What did you anticipate of Jasmine Crockett's response? Let us apperceive in the comments below. And don't balloon to allotment this with anyone who needs to see how to handle political bullies. Hit that notification alarm so you're the aboriginal. To apperceive aback, we beat our abutting atomic political story. This adventure proves that in politics, alertness beats position every distinct time. Aback, you appear for someone. You bigger accomplish abiding, you've done your appointment aboriginal, because if you haven't, you adeptness aloof, get the apprenticeship of a lifetime on a live television. Jasmine Crockett didn't aloof avert herself. That day she showed the absolute country what absolute political administration looks like in the 21st century. The barter additionally serves as a absolute admonition that in our amusing media age, every political moment can become a defining moment. One adorable acknowledgement can change careers, about-face narratives, and affect millions of bodies who are annoyed of seeing bullies get abroad with their tactics. Sometimes all it takes is one actuality, accommodating to angle up and action aback with facts, preparation, and the adventuresomeness to allege accuracy to